I think that's a good segue to move, towards what are the possible outcomes for the U.S. dollar in the near term and the long term. I think the possibility of the U.S. dollar being replaced by a basket of currencies as the world reserve currency at some time in the future, may become reality. That may be something that happens versus just a single country currency. That may be possible. Perhaps gold becomes a viable currency once again. I mean, if the dollar crisis does hit and it implodes, maybe they move away from a fiat currency and go back to gold because it's finite in its resources and its total quantity. But you're starting to see central bankers moving away and moving into gold just recently. So while I don't think that's imminent, I think central bankers are becoming concerned because they're moving to gold as a result. And again, non-dollar payment channel technologies are creating, they're created quickly, and that could possibly tip the scale. I mean, if you look at the dollar dominance, combined with Washington's weaponization of the currency geopolitically, I think a lot of these countries find it untenable, and they're just, they may be kind of fed up with it. And who knows, those technologies may facilitate that.
Darren, I think one thing that you're pointing out already, and what we've talked about and discussed, is for the people that are investors that are paying attention to this, is if you assume what's called scenario planning, so you assume at some point in the future the U.S. dollar is no longer the currency, and now then you work backwards instead of working from 2020 to some 2030 scenario of kind of a linear thinking. You go, okay, assume that the U.S. dollar is no longer the currency. Looking back, well, looking backwards from the future, if you can imagine that type of thinking, you're trying to say, what are the signals that I should be taking a look at, and what are the yellow flags, the red flags that you pointed out already that we ought to be taking a look at to say, okay, this scenario of the dollar losing its foreign currency status may be more predictable in the short term than what it might be today in 2020, if that makes sense.
Correct. I mean, hindsight's 2020, right? So I think it could happen 10 to 20 years from now. But look, if you look at the history of reserve currencies going back 150 years, the U.S. wasn't always the preeminent reserve. So, I think that the future, obviously, we don't know what is going to happen, but if you start putting things together, you may start to conclude that the erosions is starting to occur, and we may, it may accelerate due to some black swan event that we're not aware of. Is going to happen. So I think that's a good point, Steve. And I think really to your point, Andrew, in terms of slack in the supply of the United States, in terms of can we produce more, can we, can we have more output, and how it relates to inflation. Clearly the economy has been delivered a significant blow here due to the government shutdown. And I think the amount of money that's sitting on the sidelines, something in excess of $4 trillion in cash that consumers are sitting on, could that surge in purchasing demand given the relative constraints in supply, cause a spike in CPI and PPI. I mean, is this the most possible outcome for the US dollar here in the near term?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. In my mind, I would say that we've got a long ways to go. You do see quite a few macroeconomists talking about essentially a global savings glut that's going on right now. So a lot of that, a currency, technically printing a currency, really what happens first is the debt gets printed first. So in my mind, a lot of that is the result of a savings glut in the private sector to a large extent. And so there is a lot of cash sitting on the sidelines. If that comes back into the economy, obviously the federal government can certainly raise interest rates by, selling off stuff, selling off their dollar-denominated assets, and reversing quantitative easing and those types of things. So they still have a lot of levers in their toolbox, and I think the capacity for us to reach full capacity, we are a very, very long way from that. So, actually it would be, I think we would see maybe faster growth than we saw in this last anemic recovery if we saw a lot of those assets coming off the sideline and being put to work in private businesses and business investment and consumer spending and all of that type of stuff.
Sure.
You realize that we lost 6 years of GDP growth with COVID, and we were in one of the longest economic expansions the United States has ever seen since the end of the Great Recession, but at a very moderate 2% rate. So the loss that we've seen takes even more than 6 years to make up if we could get back to that kind of moderate growth rate. And while there is kind of a glut in savings, that's the upper 1/3 of our population that actually is saving. When you look at the blue collar workers and minimum wage workers, they weren't saving much to start with anyway, but they were spending everything they were making, and they lost their jobs, and the government supplemented them so that they could at least keep their heads above water, pay their rent, buy food, and put gas in their car. It's going to be a while before that comes back, especially if the government doesn't come up with another support package for those people. So I think we're in for a long, slow recovery of probably a couple of years, followed by a similar moderate growth pattern that we had after the Great Recession. Definitely no question that this is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. Much more highly likely it's a U-shaped recovery.
Sure.
Well, can I just interject one thing? I looked at Atlanta Fed does the GDP now, and their estimate for the third quarter GDP as of 17th of September is 32%. But we went down 32%, so coming up 32% is not exactly getting back to normal, getting back to a baseline, but then the next iteration is actually going to be coming out on the 25th of September. So at least they're showing some positive growth for the third quarter.
Sure.
Right.
From my perspective, I think getting us back to previous recovery rates of over 3% or something like that in GDP growth is going to become increasingly harder as we continue. This is another event that's basically shifted wealth into the top 1% of the population. and you have a lot of the smaller business owners, entrepreneurs, restaurant owners, et cetera, who are going bankrupt and they're never coming back. And all of that, versus, the people with wealth are going to be the ones who can come in and kind of buy those properties up, buy those businesses up, and they're going to be the ones to start new businesses, and they're probably not going to be doing that at the scale that we would need to get all of those entrepreneurs back into the economy. And so in my mind, it's, again, it's going to be conservative GDP growth, because the top 1% is going to be conservative in putting their money back to work, and the bottom 99% doesn't have the money. They're going to be, they've lost a bunch of their wealth.
Right, and I just ran the math quickly. After a 32% drop in GDP, at the new lower base GDP number, it takes a 47% increase just to get back to zero from the 32% drop. So, like I say, this is going to be long and slow.
Yep. I think I agree with all of you. I think we're in for some pain through 2021 for sure.